have Iain McGilchrist with us, and he is talking in our contemporary animism programme tonight. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that programme, it's really about how we as human beings see ourselves at this moment in these unfolding times. So we've invited Iain because we feel that he's got a rather particular viewpoint on that. That is to do with how our brain is wired. Iain is a psychiatrist and an author. I'm sure a lot of you will have read his fabulous book, The Master and His Emissary, and he has a new book out called The Matter with Things, which we are going to talk about tonight. So, hi Iain, hello, thanks for joining us.
Hello, thank you so much for asking me along. I hope we'll have a fun conversation.
Yeah. Brilliant, okay. So, without further ado then, Iain, I wonder if you will be able to tell us, summarise for us, which I'm sure isn't an easy job. What is the matter with things?
Well, as you will probably all agree with me, something is the matter with things because the situation, the predicament in which we find ourselves seems to me fairly grave. So at one level, the topic of the book is why we're in the mess I take it that we are in. Other parts of the title refer to other parts of my theme. So one of the reasons I think that we are in the difficulties we're in is because we think in terms only of a material world, matter, and one that is therefore made up of things. To cut to the chase, I believe that things are a perfectly acceptable shortcut in our thinking. I don't mind carrying on referring to things myself, but I think that underlying them there are processes and encounters rather than the sort of isolated entities that the word thing tends to conjure up. And the story of this book, in brief, is quite funny, really. I wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary, and that came out in 2009. And quite soon people started saying to me, you know, this book's got a lot of very interesting ideas in it that ought to be rather widespread. But it's a long book, and I don't know that many people will read it. So why don't you write a shorter book? So I then got a contract with a well-known publishing house, Penguin Random House, to do a shorter version. And as soon as I started doing it, I thought, well, there's nothing in this for me. What on earth is the point in spending whatever years I've got left saying much more crudely and less interestingly something that I'd taken pains to say with greater subtlety at greater length? And also the statistics proved that it was wrong that people weren't reading it. Well, at least they were buying it. So I didn't feel the urgency to do that. But what came out for me was the need to explore the philosophical consequences of the idea that each part of your brain, each hemisphere of the brain, is capable of sustaining consciousness on its own, and the version of the world that it brings into being for us is different in either case. And in the end, they're not strictly compatible. With a certain degree of fudging, we can get by. And we're not aware of that fudging going on until we start thinking explicitly about it. And this really came from trying to answer some fairly profound philosophical questions, because I do think we're at a great turning point in the history of the West. It may turn out to be the last turning point in the history of the West. I hope not. But I think that we risk bringing many things down with us through our short-sightedness and the way in which we think about the world as a heap of resources for us to use in any way that happens to suit our purposes for the time being. And the questions, therefore, are, who are we? What is the world? And what's the connection between them? What are we doing here? And it seems to me that never before in recorded history have we been more unable to answer any of these questions, more perfectly at sea, more unable to find any reason for our being here, any concept of what we're doing here, or even what a human being is. Now, if you're going to do that sort of stuff, you're going to do some fairly hefty kind of philosophizing. The first question, it seems to me, that you've got to answer is, if there are two versions of the world, which one are we going to believe? And so the book begins with a part which is about 400 pages long, which explains how the two hemispheres get quite different versions of the world. And what I look at in the first part of the book, this first part, which is neuropsychology, is at what I call the portals to an understanding of the world, the ways in which we get any information about the world at all, or can make any kind of basic sense of it. Before we start working on it in any bigger way, how does the world come to us? Well, very importantly, it comes to us through attention. The way in which we attend changes what we find, and it changes us as well. I call attention a moral act, therefore. And then, of course, there's perception, which is not the same as attention, but is what we make of things that come to our senses. And then there's what I call judgment, which is the understanding or thoughts that we have about what it is we're seeing. When we see something, we don't just see a lot of blobs or data on a screen, as it were, in our heads. We see something formed already that we anticipate is there. And so our thinking comes into perception. So all these three, attention, perception, and judgment, although they're different, are involved in the same process. And very quickly on the heels of those come, and part of the process of making thoughts or judgments or having opinions or an understanding of what we're seeing, comes our intelligence. And I don't just mean cognitive intelligence, IQ, which is very important, but emotional and social intelligence as well. And finally, there's a degree of creativity. In other words, we go to meet the world, and in doing so, we make something up. Not that we make up reality in some ghastly postmodern way and there is no truth, nor in some naive objectivist way that the world just is out there, irrespective of how we approach it, but something that I take some care in the early pages of the book to finesse, which is a view that isn't either of these, but that we make an honest encounter. It's up to us to be as truthful in the way in which we dispose our attention as we can, but that what we find is a something that comes into being between us and the world. And what I show in brief in part 1, which consists of 9 chapters, is that in every case but one, the right hemisphere is more veridical, more reliable than the left. It gives a better picture of reality by any measure that we can take. And part of the evidence is that in the many interesting, fascinating syndromes which occur in psychiatry and neuropsychiatry, where people become quite alienated from the reality that we share, those extraordinary delusions and hallucinations tend to follow on damage or limitation to the right hemisphere of the brain, almost always, very rarely the left. So the building of a true world for us to inhabit, experience, and share is the task of the right hemisphere. And the left hemisphere's task, meanwhile, is simply to enable us to exploit it, to manipulate it, to use it. So I make a distinction between apprehension and comprehension. Apprehension sometimes is used to mean understanding, but I'm using it in a slightly more restricted way, governed by its etymology, which is to grasp hold of something, to latch onto it in order to get it, and to have it, to possess it, to use it. And don't forget the left hemisphere controls the right hand, which for most of us is the grasping hand, and controls those aspects of language which enable us to speak about things and say, I've got it, I've grasped it. Now, over evolution, very, very briefly, I think what has happened is the left hemisphere has evolved to be more and more a virtual repository of diagrammatic information, theories about reality, a map of reality, and the very, very important job of holding on to reality, onto experience, has therefore been left with the right hemisphere. So the right hemisphere is our guide, our rock in reality. The left hemisphere, meanwhile, has a useful map. And there's nothing wrong with a map. We wouldn't be better off for not having maps. We wouldn't be better off for not having a left hemisphere. But it's a mistake when you start to think you live in the map, as I believe we do now. And it's a mistake when the left hemisphere, the emissary in the title of the master and his emissary, the one that does the bidding of the master, that doesn't know what the master knows, only knows a fraction, but can do some useful administrative work. It's a mistake when that person, that entity, thinks it is the master. And that's when things go wrong. So then the second part of the book, and this will have a culmination fairly soon, I go into is quite easily and briefly described. It's epistemology. Epistemology is that branch of philosophy where we say, how is it that we get to know anything at all? So when we've done all this business of gathering information through what I call the various portals, as discussed in part one, what path do we take in trying to understand the world, make sense of it? What do we rely on for truth? Well, most people would say science, and I wouldn't disagree with that one bit. And a lot of people would say reason, too. I think those would be the two top choices, and I don't demur from either of those. They are of critical importance, and they both seem to me under attack from people who mean no good in the world we're in now, which is not to say that they can't be valorized, vaunted, and make claims that they can't fulfill. That is certainly true. But as long as their claims are reasonably modest and realistic, they are essential to us. But there are two other ways in which we can make sense of the world that have fallen on harder times and are not so much valorized these days. And those are intuition and imagination. And I believe, in fact, that intuition, in particular, has been subjected to a motivated attack in which we've been taught completely to undermine any confidence we have in our intuitions. This is very dangerous. Our intuitions can certainly lead us astray, but so can pure reason and science. They all involve intuition. In fact, most of what is good about using reason involves fusing a kind of logic with experience and intuitive understanding of a situation. Most of the great breakthroughs in the history of science and mathematics were not, in fact, made by following a sequential routine, a set of algorithms, as we are sometimes taught to believe, but were made actually by intuitive grasping of a whole, of a gestalt, of a new form, seeing a pattern, and there was an aha moment and things fell into place. So these things are enormously important, and indeed I argue that imagination, unlike fantasy, is not something that takes us away from reality, but is in fact our only chance of really feeling our way into reality, experiencing it for the first time and understanding it. And then we come to the third part of the book, which is metaphysics, which is to say, so now we've decided which versions of the world we're going to think are probably more reliable. Now we've seen the ways in which we need to bring to bear our understanding using all those faculties, reason, science, intuition, and imagination. What do we find when we look at the cosmos? And I say, well, there are two things about its overall structure that are very important. One is that opposites coincide, not as we now think that they're on either ends of a dipole, and if you push further and further in one direction, you'll get further and further away from the thing you fear. In fact, what will happen is that sooner or later you will start coming round to exactly the thing you hope to avoid. And another important insight is the relationship between the one and the many, something that is central to all the great philosophies of the East and is there in many important traditions in the philosophy of the West. And after that, I go on to look at the building blocks of the cosmos, as those of us who think in such materialistic terms would probably term them. So what is the cosmos made of? Time, space, motion in the form of flow, matter, consciousness. So far, so good. But I also include, and this may surprise some people, values, purpose, and a sense of the sacred as probably the three most important, irreducible components of the cosmos that we don't make up or invent, but that we discover or fail to discover in our period of consciousness that we call our embodied life. So that is a guide to the book. I'm sorry it took me a little while, but there's quite a lot in it to cover, and it's, I'm afraid, a long, long book. It took me, well, the actual writing took me 10 years, but I've been gestating it for about 30. And it's the longest and the largest and the last book of any size that I will write. So I hand over to you. That's it for the moment.
Fantastic. Well, I could jump off anywhere from that, Iain. Thank you so much. And well, thank you for summarising it like that. So for those people who haven't read The Master's Hemisphere, I'm going to try and summarise really simply then, so that we can kind of, I really want to understand where we are and how we can kind of make it better. You know, that's a kind of trite thing to say, but the situation that you see is that we have two sides of our brain. One is connected to the kind of sense of sacred, imagination, that kind of area, and that's the master. Then we have the left side that is the kind of servant of it, and is the map maker and the data analyzer and the kind of the hook into our everyday world. And it's that left brain that has become much more kind of important and that is the one that's been given most credibility in our culture at this moment, which has led to the kind of difficulties that we're experiencing in the world. Would you say that's a fair summary, just for those who haven't? Yeah.
Yes, I would, but I'd like to refine it in a few ways, if I may.
Yes.
Okay. Excuse me. Sorry about this. There we are. No, you emphasized, understandably, the last things I mentioned, which were the business about imagination and the sense of the sacred. But I want to get away from the idea, which is part of the bad old wrong idea about the difference between the hemispheres, which is that basically the right hemisphere is a kind of superannuated hippie, that it's kind of peace, man, it paints paintings, its love is all there is, and it's high on dope. And the left hemisphere is nonetheless the one that keeps the show on the road. Maybe a little bit boring, might be a bit like an accountant. You might not want to have it to dinner, but at least it's reliable. All of this is complete and utter tosh, which is why the first thing I have to get over is how people have this idea of pop psychology of what they say about the hemispheres, but none of that is true, or almost none of it is true. So, in fact, it turns out that the right hemisphere is much more down to earth than the left. It's the one that actually understands not just, of course, it's much better at understanding imagination and the sense of the sacred and these values, but it is also the one that has a much better grasp of our day-to-day being. It's the left hemisphere, left to itself, that becomes frankly deluded very quickly. It is extraordinary. I mean, you'd have to read the first part of the book, any of you, to see how vivid this is. But I do make it very vivid. I take examples of case histories, and you see what happens to a human being when they're trying to exist without the proper functioning of their right hemisphere. So I just wanted to make that point. And I also wanted to say that the left hemisphere is not by any means reliable. It's the one that jumps to conclusions. The right hemisphere is much more thoughtful. It tends to say, well, yes, that could be right, but it might be different, you know. It's not at all what you hear in pop psychology. Nor is the left hemisphere somehow emotionless. In fact, the emotion that lateralizes most strongly of all is anger. And guess what? It lateralizes to the left. So it's not this calm, reasonable thing. It is an analyzer, and there's nothing wrong with an analysis. I mean, I think analysis is wonderful. The only thing is you mustn't stop at the end of your analysis and say, well, there's a heap of bits on the garage floor, and I can't make any sense of it, can you? You analyze things in order to be able to see the enriched whole once more. So you need to put them together again. And in that sense, I often say it's a bit like a piece of music that you're attracted to initially as a whole. And we know the right hemisphere is attracted to whole new experiences. It's the one that first experiences them. But then if you want to play it, you realize you have to practice bits of it. You have to break it up. You have to look at its theoretical structure as a sonata or whatever it might be. And that's the job of the left hemisphere. But when you come to actually play it, then you must forget all of that. And that's back to the right hemisphere to have a now richer, integrated performance of the whole. And what seems to me to happen in our world is we take things apart. We do the left hemisphere's bit and say, well, it all appears to be made of matter. I can't find any values in it. It all seems to be rather meaningless, and all the bits don't relate to one another. That must be what the universe is like. That's the predicament we're in. And so just very briefly to outline what these different worlds look like, the left hemisphere's world is one made up of fragments that are not connected until we put them together. These fragments are certain. They're things that it's familiar with, that it knows already, that it has a category of. So, I see, it's one of those. I can put it in my box of those. Got it. So it has things that are fixed, certain, known, sterile, isolated, decontextualized, abstract, disembodied, and basically inanimate. And the right hemisphere sees, meanwhile, a world in which everything is ultimately interconnected. Nothing is wholly isolated, in which everything is moving, changing, and flowing, not static and known. It's always becoming something new. It is, in fact, the hemisphere that understands the unique, not just the general case. And for it, the implicit is at least as important as the explicit. The embodied is more important than something that is totally disembodied. And it sees the world as fundamentally animate. So I think that's important to get straight at this stage in the evening. And just to go back to your précis there, the second half of the Master and His Emissary is a review of cultural history from the Greeks up to the present day. And effectively what I suggest is that 3 times in the history of West, we've had a very highly productive, fertile synthesis or symbiosis of the best of what the left hemisphere can give with the best of what the right hemisphere can give. The proper relationship between the two hemispheres, in which the right hemisphere is the master, but the left hemisphere is doing good work as a faithful servant. But that in each of these 3 cases, we degenerated into the loss of a civilization by going further and further towards the worldview of the left hemisphere. This is what happened in Greece. This is what happened in Rome. And this is what is happening, I believe, now, since the Enlightenment, as we go further and further into a world of sterile, bureaucratic, metrical analysis of the world, in which everything that matters is left out.
Why do you think this is how the brain has evolved? Do you give a kind of theory about
well, there are two. Yes, I suspect you may not be asking me the question, why did the brain evolve to have these 2 different hemispheres? You're asking me why in each case did the civilization drift in that direction. Have I understood your question right?
Yeah, I'm actually asking you both. I'm aware we've got little time. I kind of wanted to know the first one before we went on to the second one. But
well, the first one can be stated rather simply. It's that every living creature, needs to solve a conundrum, which is how to live and yet remain alive. That sounds paradoxical, but in fact it's a very important point, because in order to live, it has to get things from the environment. In the first place, it has to be able to eat. That means seizing on something that it needs accurately, swiftly, and being able to take it for its own use. And then it moves on to being able to grasp things in order to make clothes, to build shelter, for a bird to build its nest. For us, in other words, to make ourselves secure in what we call our environment. And that means paying a very highly focused, detail-orientated, narrow beam attention to something that we already know what it is because it's the thing we need now and we're going to get it. However, if that was the only attention that the creature was paying, it would become somebody else's lunch while it was getting its own, because it has to be able to take in the whole picture of the world at the same time, which is literally everything else. So predators, yes. Conspecifics, yes. Its own young that need feeding, yes. Everything that is happening, apart from the business of grabbing and getting. So that's how it evolved. And in the human being, it's simply gone to a rather extreme case in which the left hemisphere is only interested in matters of manipulation. And that is its raison d'etre. And all the rest about understanding has been, as we're left with, the right hemisphere. The other question, why do we always move, it seems, in this one direction, is not to do with evolution. I want to get that idea out of the picture. I'm not suggesting that if you scanned people's brains 2,000 years ago, you'd find something terrifically different going on. I think the brains would look largely the same, and probably a lot of the functioning would be quite similar. But it is more to do with the functioning than the structure. So it's more like this. Suppose you buy a radio set. You've never had one, and you're delighted, and you find a couple of radio channels that are just the thing for you, and you start listening to those. But after a while, you tune in only to one. The radio set will bring you just as many channels as before, but you've decided to tune into only one. That is what happens. It's not that we can't, it's that we won't. We've disattended to a whole area of our potential experience. And I think that's to do with a number of things. One is the seductive value of grabbing and getting. It makes one rich and powerful, and that is enormously heady, and unfortunately people don't want to give it up, quite understandably. And what happens to civilizations is they overreach themselves, either militarily or in terms of geography or in terms of a commercial empire, as the West now has. So in those circumstances, you're trying to deal with something much too big, and everything subtle, everything individual is lost under the rolling out, as we say, of some new algorithm that will sort all our problems out. So this way of thinking becomes entrenched in a civilization. It becomes less human, less flexible, less alive, less certainly subtle, much more black and white, either or, all or nothing in its way of thinking. And this, of course, spells disaster, because the world is nothing like that, actually. So I think that is, in brief, what happens. And also in a civilization like ours, where we've rather done away with the implicit ways of understanding, which used to come through things like sharing a religion and its rituals and its festivals, living close to nature with its rituals and festivals and its daily testimony to a living world of which we form part, out of which we come and to which we must return. We live farther from these things now, and all our ideas about things tend to be generated through radio and increasingly the internet, so through chat rooms and things like that, in which only a very degraded kind of converse about the world can go on. There's no room for all those subtle things that are expressed in poetry, in tragedy, in narratives, in myths, in music. Instead, our world has been reduced to a very pedestrian one. And in that world, I'm afraid the left hemisphere has full reign, because it's the one that can do, believes, in fact, its own very stupid, simple sound bites.
So you talked about 3 times in history, Iain, where civilizations kind of collapsed because of this. How did the reset happen after those collapses?
Well, after the last fall of an empire, which happened very, very quickly at the end, in a year or so, about 410 AD, it took nearly 1,000 years for Western civilization to recover. That's a sobering thought, because we don't have 1,000 years to recover. We need to do something very quickly about what we're doing to destroy the natural world. I think what happens in general is that we can, as long as a culture is viable and hasn't got into an extreme position, we are able to correct or make corrections when we see that things are moving too far in one direction. We can then help a movement in the other direction. What happens seems to us inauthentic, and we crave something of the opposite, and so the pendulum moves back again. And I think I can show that, and did show that in the second part of The Master and His Emissary, in talking about the various movements since the early Renaissance through to postmodernism, that we have made these shifts or swings of the pendulum. But eventually there comes a position where, instead of getting helpful negative feedback, I'm using that term in the strict scientific sense, not in the popular sense. Negative feedback means that a position of overreach is then corrected in the way that a thermostat senses the temperature is too high or low and tries to get it back on tack. Instead, what happens is positive feedback feeds in, and that's a situation in which more simply causes more, rather than more leading to less. And I think that's the situation we're in now, of positive feedback, in which more of the same thing that we have been doing is cried out for, demanded on all sides. Control, more ways of thinking about it that are really the ways in which we came to be in this fix in the first place.
So we move to the remedial bit then. Do you think it's possible to kind of remediate now? How do we go about that?
I do. I think it is possible, and I think it's absolutely essential that we begin where we are. We can, of course, move in the bigger, more public arena. Some of us more likely are able to do that than others, but we can all begin from the lives we lead, and indeed nothing more of us can be asked morally than for us to do the bit that we can. But it is very important that we do what we can. And I used to think that most of this was addressed to the very familiar topic, which thank goodness people are very much more aware of than they used to be, of the destruction of what I call nature, but other people call the environment. I call it nature because nature puts us in touch with the female goddess. It actually means something ever about to be, whereas the environment is some ghastly technical thing. You could have a department of the environment which surrounds us and which is not us, but in fact nature is us. We are part of nature. That, I think, of course, remains, if not our most pressing concern, certainly one of the two. But the other one that now troubles me more and more with every passing month is the acceleration into destruction of our civilization. This is happening in many ways. It's happening through the all or nothing, black and white refusal to carry on a civilized discourse with people who disagree with you, in which all the many subtleties of various positions can be teased out. It's happening very much to my grief in universities, a place which hold, in some cases, 1,000-year-old tradition. My alma mater, Oxford, 1,000 years of holding together the thinking and the civilization that we are heirs to. And it's rapidly being destroyed by a kind of newspeak in which words have their meaning inverted and things can't be talked about and so on. This is an utter tragedy. It will destroy us perhaps even quicker than the decline of nature, because this could lead to societal breakdown. And when that happens, there will be more immediate and greater infliction of damage than will happen through the environmental or natural catastrophe that we also face. So we need to be aware of both these things and resist them, not to fall in also with bureaucratic ways of solving things. These are a hopeless quagmire. Every useful institution, a hospital, a university, anything that I know, is now swamped by an exponentially increasing burden of bureaucracy. And when you talk to the bureaucrats, they themselves are swamped by it too. They can't do anything about it. It's completely mistaken to think that you know, in that way that we do, that there's some, you know, our paranoid fantasy that there are people trying to control the world. I don't think that's right at all. There are things that are bigger than us, and they're controlling us. So that even when we think we're doing the righteous thing, we're actually helping to destroy. So we need to be very self-critical, and we need to be aware not to blame other people for what is happening, but to see these bigger patterns and to stop the worsening of this decline into the virtual world of bureaucratic solutions, managerial overload, and start thinking in a passionate but compassionate way about the world that we share with other human beings. A bit of humility, a bit of awe before the world, and a bit of compassion above all for other people who don't see the things the way we see things. We may not be able to see everything. In fact, I think that's probably the underestimate of the year.
Great, thank you, Iain. I'm going to open it up to questions in a moment. So if you have a question for Iain, if you could raise your hand digitally, that's the best way for me to see you. Just while we're waiting for people, Iain, just to kind of finish that then, well, not that it'll ever be finished, but so we talk about it in ways of reanimating ourselves, you know, and I love the way you said, you actually used the word animate and inanimate when you were talking about the different sides of the brain. You know,
absolutely.
We talk about practices, you know, of kind of working with our relationship with nature, understanding ourselves as part of it. Can you kind of, from a brain perspective, think of practices? You know, you gave some things there about ways to think, but have you got any more thoughts on that?
Yes, I certainly have. I think there are many practices that we can incorporate in our life and ultimately should be incorporated in our education, our educational system, which encourage a more flexible, a much broader, a more subtle, a more alive way of looking at the world. And these start from fairly simple, but nonetheless very important and potentially powerful things, like incorporating mindfulness into our lives. And I think that children should never be able to leave school without having incorporated into their lives the idea that instead of constantly being besieged by random stimuli, that they need to set aside a space in which they actually still their mind and are present for once with the world, because they won't be present with it for very long. Then, of course, there are the other things that I mentioned earlier that give richness to life. Religion with its rituals, spiritual practices, engagement with the arts, as we say now, but are really the means whereby we understand the deeper meaning of the cosmos through poetry, through narratives, through myths, through art, through music. These things are so powerful, and unfortunately we're driving them out of our educational system because it's thought that purely technical subjects are more important. Well, of course, if your left hemisphere is the one that's in control, it's only interested in grabbing and getting and manipulating, and those are the tools of the left hemisphere. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not denigrating them. I'm not denigrating people who do them. They just are only one part of the mix. We wouldn't be better if we didn't have people who knew how to operate machinery, who knew how to think in certain ways. It's valuable. The problem is when it becomes the master. I can't emphasize that too much, because sometimes people think I've got it in for all kinds of ways of thinking and being in the world. I only have it in for the fact that they now dominate and have driven out the other important elements. So I think those are some of the important ideas, none of them very original. But I do want to just emphasize that when I say the right hemisphere sees things as animate and the left inanimate, I mean this very literally. That after a right hemisphere stroke, people will see things that they used to see as alive, as no longer alive. They'll see people perhaps as zombies, machines, cyborgs, the way in which, of course, our culture is now taking us towards the mechanical, even destroying the human being by turning it into just another not very efficient computer. So that is important. But when the right hemisphere is liberated from left hemisphere input, it tends to see things that we wouldn't normally think of as alive, as in many cultures, non-Western, indigenous cultures, do in fact see parts of the world that we call inanimate as alive. And there's a film that was made about my work called The Divided Brain, and in it I'm privileged to have a discourse with Leroy Littlebear, who's a Blackfoot chief, and in it, he talks about the vision of the Blackfoot of the world, which accords very much, in my view, with the right hemisphere vision I'm trying to help convey. And he says, in our language, we have no word for inanimate, which doesn't surprise me at all.
Well, thank you, Iain.